so we are recording. Here we go. So one of the kind of final adaptations that we're going to see due to aerobic type training is going to be cardiac hypertrophy, specifically left ventricular hypertrophy. And so this is a really, really positive outcome for us because it's going to help us to increase our stroke volume and therefore increase our maximal cardiac output, which will help make to maximal. Okay? So there's a problem because there's two different kinds of cardiac hypertrophy that can take place. Okay? I don't know if anybody noticed yesterday, but one of the things that they've been doing with a lot of the college football players because of COVID is they've been doing echocardiograms on a bunch of them. They've been actually checking to see if they have fluid accumulation around their hearts, and they have found in several of them, they have found hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, which is an enlarged heart, which is the leading cause of sudden cardiac arrest in people under the age of 35. So we can get two kinds of cardiac hypertrophy. We're going to get one kind of hypertrophy that's going to be good for us, okay? It is a consequence of what happens during aerobic training. And then conversely, there's going to be a second kind of hypertrophy that can happen that mostly occurs in people that have high blood pressure, okay? So you see it a lot in older adults and folks that have high blood pressure, and it's actually bad, okay? So you have high blood pressure, and it's going to cause these even further poor adaptations in the heart, okay? And so what we're going to see is the difference between those two things is what we're going to call concentric versus eccentric hypertrophy, or volume overload hypertrophy versus pressure overload hypertrophy, okay? And so you may be thinking out of the black, well, what the hell's the difference between those two things? Why does it matter? How does a heart contract eccentrically, right? For the most part, it doesn't, but I'll try to explain why we determine that particular one. Okay? So we're going to start off here where we have a normal cardiac muscle cell, okay? The pathological kind of hypertrophy is this concentric hypertrophy, or what we would call pressure overload hypertrophy. So imagine that you have a person that has high blood pressure. They have very high aortic pressures, and so because of that, the left ventricle must contract very forcefully in order to raise the pressure inside the ventricle so that it overcomes the aortic pressure, okay? Now, that is like lifting a heavier and a heavier weight, okay? And so because of that, okay, you're going to get enlargements in what looks like kind of very traditional skeletal muscle hypertrophy in the cardiac muscle, okay? It's going to, the cardiac muscle fibers are going to get thicker, okay? They're going to increase in their width, they're going to get stronger, and therefore the entire heart is going to get bigger, okay? The problem with this, though, is that the cavity, okay, inside the left ventricle doesn't get any bigger. It stays the same size, but the wall of the left ventricle gets thicker and thicker and thicker, and because of that, it may lose compliance. It's not going to be as stretchy, okay? So you have a bigger heart, but it's not actually able to help you perform any better, right, and have a larger stroke volume or anything than you did beforehand. It's just getting bigger because it has to work against your already elevated blood pressure. Okay?
Is that reversible or is that
I don't know. That's a good question. My guess is it's somewhat reversible. Somewhat reversible. But I'm not a cardiologist, so I don't know. It's a good question. Callie asked me a really good question that I spent like an hour this afternoon trying to figure out the answer for. But we were waiting for the mirrors to warm up. And I sort of have an answer for Callie, but she has this unique way of asking and like seeing things. I'm like, that is going to linger with me for a long time. Because I've never thought about that, but she's found something that is a real problem. So I don't know, but I can kind of look. My guess is that it's going to have some ability to help because we do lots of cardiac rehab and stuff. If you can lower blood pressure or if you can kind of get people to exercise, then we're going to get this eccentric hypertrophy. So when you ever get it completely reversed all the way back to sort of a person that had not had anything to begin with, my guess is no, but maybe so. Okay.
Okay, going back to what you started off this whole thing with, because it's just staying in my brain. You said they were checking football players that had COVID.
Yes.
Why am I like really worried? Like, that's just a personal thing.
What do
Just
you
because I
mean?
had COVID, should I go get my mark checked?
So one of the things that they think is potentially a lingering symptom of COVID is that you get fluid accumulation, right, inside the pericardium, and that can potentially then lead to inflammation because you've got inflammation around the heart and those kinds of things. And so that seems to be a lasting symptom in some people. And so that was one of the things that they knew they needed to start doing, especially in, the cardiomyopathy. To be honest, people that are obese, people like the offensive and defensive linemen, tend to be at a greater risk of some of those things than kind of a regular person. So, I mean, I don't think you're probably in any particular danger or anything like that, Ryan. But I mean, if somebody would do one, I would be interested to know kind of what it would look like.
I'm gonna do some.
You're gonna check some stuff out. So, like, I can appreciate this because my mom has a host of autoimmune disorders, and one of the things that has happened at various points is she gets inflammation around her heart that's unexplained. And so she's been to the Cleveland Clinic, and they couldn't figure out what all was going on, and there's been a whole bunch of kind of things that we can't figure out. So we've been very concerned about this as we kind of watch these things grow and stuff. So yes, so I wouldn't freak out. It's very rare, but at the same time, it's no joke if that's going to be the case. But I assume that has some kind of lingering symptomology to it and those kinds of things that you might notice. Okay, good questions. Okay, I'm going to sort of like have to turn my entire body around here because I can't just crane my neck. For looking at eccentric hypertrophy, okay. Eccentric hypertrophy, this is from what we would call volume overload in the heart. This is the good hypertrophy. So what happens with eccentric hypertrophy is that as you exercise more, you're going to increase venous return, okay? When we increase venous return, then more blood gets into the left ventricle and it stretches, right? We're getting more stretch as we kind of fill that luminal space, and it stretches the heart. Okay. And so in response to that, we actually get this increase in sarcomeres in series rather than in parallel. So we get longer cardiac muscle fibers. Okay, they're going to be a little bit thinner and they're going to be more compliant. And so because of that, they're going to be stretchier. And so we're going to retain some level of strength, but what we really get is the heart gets bigger and the luminal space in the chambers is going to get bigger. And so that's going to have this ability for us to increase stroke volume and increase cardiac output. So this is a good adaptation because we're stretching the heart as it gets overfilled. This is in some ways a bad or a poor adaptation because we have high blood pressure and the heart has to work really, really hard. Okay, so what's interesting is that this doesn't really seem to happen in like skeletal muscle, as we'll see. This would be like, oh, well, here's the weightlifter, and here's the person that does yoga or something all the time. But this doesn't happen when you do yoga and skeletal muscle. This is mostly what we want. As you guys will see, we actually need some eccentrics to kind of bump up our increase in size in skeletal muscle healing. So, okay, all right. So this is the same kind of thing, talking about this crazy ass signaling pathways of a bunch of things that are going to lead to this cardiac hypertrophy. But you're either going to get kind of force production and kind of traditional activation of sort of mTOR-like pathways here that are going to lead to kind of cardiac hypertrophy, much like we did skeletal muscle, or we're going to get those sort of surface disruption, mechanosensitive things in the surface from that eccentric stretch, okay, that are also going to activate some transcription factors. Okay? Again, you don't have to know all of these things. I just want to present it that it's a fairly complicated kind of thing. Okay? So we talked about, I believe, on Tuesday that training alters resting heart rate. Training cannot alter max heart rate. Okay? So if we train and we get eccentric hypertrophy in the left ventricle, stroke volume goes up. If we train, we can't alter age-predicted max heart rate. If we can't, only a very small amount. But because stroke volume can go up, once we've trained, cardiac output can go up, or maximal cardiac output can go up. Okay? And because stroke volume has gone up, people that are better trained can produce the same cardiac output out of a lower heart rate than a person that is untrained. Okay? And again, it's all kind of related to FIC. So max VO2 goes up because stroke volume goes up and because AVO2 difference is going to go up. So this is more of a capillary and mitochondrial side issue, and then stroke volume goes up, and so that's going to mean cardiac output goes up, extraction goes up, and so max VO2 can go up. Okay. This is the piece, though, where if you had to pick something among people that are the same age, the person with the largest left ventricle per their body size is probably going to have the largest cardiac output per their body size, and therefore the largest VO2. Okay, so this is just showing, again, some more things from some old papers by Bink, Saltine, Phil Vonek, and it's just showing, right, here we have systemic changes in oxygen consumption, right, and how much of that is due to a change in cardiac output, AVO2 difference, blood volume, okay. Then we've got leg-specific things, so there's the systemic side, and then things in the legs, and I believe A is like 8 weeks of training, and B is 16 weeks of training, or something like that. But you will note that, right, when we look at all of this, oxidative enzymes or mitochondrial enzymes go up dramatically more than VO2 goes up. Okay, whereas the change in VO2 seems to much more closely kind of be dependent upon like these changes in cardiac output and things like that, or these changes in capillaries and things that we're going to have. So what that's going to tell us in some ways is that probably if we have to pick a thing that's limiting the adaptation in VO2, it's probably not oxidative enzyme, it's not mitochondria. It's going to be kind of central circulation or our ability to get blood into the capillaries and get it diffused across into the mitochondria. Okay? So that's kind of what's going to be there. Boom, boom. Okay. I don't know if we mentioned this at all, but in general, most people who start off untrained can increase their VO2 max maybe somewhere between 15 to 25 or 30%. Okay? About 40% of the ability to change VO2 max is genetic. They've got some really fascinating studies in identical twins. And so some people can get a big increase, some people get no increase. We don't fully understand why that is. The genetics of that is a little less well understood in comparison to the, we know what some of the genes that are going to code for making you kind of big responders or big muscle mass responders in that particular, from the VO2 max standpoint, because it's a little more complicated. We don't fully understand all of this. Okay. Okay, my last little bit here is, these are some data from Martin Javala's lab at McMaster, and we have traditional here, CT stands for continuous training, IT stands for interval training. What they did in this, so we'll ask anybody, who's done a Wingate test? Anybody done a Wingate test? Yeah, Jacob, you've done a Wingate test? Colin, you've done a Wingate? Jacob, describe a Wingate test to us.
Well, you're feeling pretty good at the start, right? You're going fast, and then you hit a brick wall and it hurts like no other, and then when you get off, you feel like you're gonna faint and puke.
Okay, but what are you doing during the test?
You're cycling as like, or I guess the way K-State did it was we cycled like as hard as we could for like 10 seconds or something, I think, maybe 5 seconds. I don't remember the exact details. And then they put a percentage of our body weight just instantaneously on the bike, and we had to try to continue to keep that speed up and that intensity up
Huh?
for
How
a
long did you
certain
have to do that for?
what?
And for how long did you have to do that?
I don't remember the exact time period, honestly. It's been a couple years since I've had to do it.
Okay, Kelvin, do you remember?
Yeah, it's 30 seconds of
That's
just
right.
hell.
Yes. So in a Wingate test, it is like 70% of your body weight is the resistance on the bike, give or take. And you pedal as fast as you can against that resistance for 30 seconds. It is maybe the most terrible thing in the entire world to do. Really and truly, right? During the Wingate lab, which we can't do here, they will not let us do it, the IRB one, in our undergraduate classes. When I was a TA at Georgia, you would TA for the undergraduate lab, and they would do that. We wouldn't tell the new people, but basically every time somebody does it, somebody's going to pass out or somebody's going to puke. Like that was the way of it. And we did that until somebody fainted and whacked their head on the water fountain, and we had to call an ambulance on them, and so then we stopped doing those kinds of things. But it's awful, okay? So when you see interval training here, this protocol is 5 Wingate tests on the same day, okay? You do the 30-second bout, then you sort of just chill on the bike at like no resistance and pedal for 2.5 minutes. Then you do another one, right? And so the whole thing takes like 15 minutes, and you're doing 2.5 minutes of actual real exercise, but you really, really hate yourself by the end of all of this. So they did that 3 days a week for 6 weeks. That's this interval training, okay? The continuous training was 3 days per week, and it's like 65% of VO2 max for like a half an hour to start with running, okay? Or maybe it was cycling. But this is this kind of idea of traditional training, and then there's the interval training. And this is change in VO2 max, okay? Relatively similar change in VO2 max from both things. This is change in cardiac output. They got a slightly larger increase in cardiac output in the interval training group. They saw it was almost significant. This was only 6 weeks, so that's a little on the short end for what we see with continuous training. This is going to be sort of O2 extraction, and you will note an increase in O2 extraction in both, which is going to give us some ideas about mitochondria and capillaries. And then this was time to exhaustion at a certain percentage of their maximal power output. And what you can see is that it went up in both groups, but our folks that were used to doing this very high intensity stuff were able to go longer. Okay? So this has been done over and over again in a host of different ways. They originally suggested that we should have people that are obese and diabetic, like your grandma should be doing this, should be doing the repeated Wingate tests. They then dialed that back that you should do 10 1-minute bouts at VO2 max, or at the work rate that would elicit VO2 max, which to me in some ways seems just as bad. They've got it down now that if you'll do 3 days a week, if you do 3 20-second bouts, that you can get about the same kind of a thing. They even tried the 20-second bouts in a dorm. They had people sprint up the stairs in the fire stairs in the dorm. And they got basically the same adaptations that they would get doing that. So high intensity interval training can produce very, very similar improvements in aerobic kind of exercise adaptations as this continuous training. Okay, and so this is going to be a thing where the training sucks even more, but it doesn't take that long, and then you can be done and get on with your day, and you can get these kind of very powerful adaptations, which should tell you something about the importance of intensity, the importance of taxing the mitochondria, the importance of going at a high intensity to try to really tax heart rate and stroke volume and cardiac output. Okay, Alex.
I have read that before too, that it's becoming more and more popular to use that for special populations or these populations. But what are some of the contraindications for not doing that? Like, at what point would you say it's definitely not beneficial, or the risk is too high for someone?
I would be uncomfortable having like people that are post heart attack do this without a cardiologist present, to be completely honest. If you've got people that have high blood pressure and take like beta blockers or things, like they're not going to be able to do that much. Although you can make an argument that like just like walking for a lot of those people, it's going to be like minimal training. They're that unfit. You know, we had a girl when I was finishing my PhD that she was a year behind me, and she wanted to do this kind of training in obese, college-aged, pre-diabetic women, and she could not keep them enrolled in the study. They'd make it a week, and they would stop. They were doing 3 days a week of the 5 wing gates. And she'd have them come in like in groups of 5 and like do it all together, right? And like encourage each other, and they would all quit, just all quit. And so there's a reason that people that are sedentary tend to be sedentary. They don't like, it's hard to get them to want to do these kinds of things because it just sucks. It's awful. And so, you know, you get a lot of bang for your buck in a short period of time, right? Do we all have 15 minutes? Sure, right? Do I want to spend my 15 minutes doing that shit? No, right? Absolutely not. So, but there we go. That's kind of the thing. And so what you see though is that a lot of kind of popular workout programs or things will incorporate stuff like this now, right? Like CrossFit does some interval stuff. If you go to Orange Theory or something, they do interval things where you shift and you do these kind of shorter bouts of high intensity stuff. I'm assuming if you have a Peloton and you do classes and stuff with Peloton, or you go to spin classes, you do things that are kind of like this where you alternate these kind of periods of high intensity stuff where you go for a shorter period of time. So I don't know that it would be absolutely contraindicated in necessarily anybody that can clear like a medical screen or those kinds of things, but it's more of a practical matter. Like practically, what can you get people to do? So there we go. Okay. Thoughts, questions, concerns? Jacob, did you puke when you did it?
No, but I had to sit down.
Oh yeah, you got to sit down afterwards. It's great. It's also one of those tests that really, 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 if you graph the power output over time during a wind gate, it's really, really useful for showing depletion of creatine phosphate during exercise. Because people are just crushing it for about 10 seconds. And then it's just like, it just peters out. And then you get to about 15 or 18 seconds, and your creatine phosphate is gone, your ATP stores are gone, and you feel like trash, and that's like the longest, the back half is like the longest, like 15 seconds of real life, or something like that. So there you go. Okay. All right. So let's do some critical thinking kinds of things. So Callie, I'm going to try to answer your question now. Is that okay? And then we'll do some critical thinking. So Callie, do you want to share with the class what your question was? How you poke holes in all the things that I learned 20 years ago that I'm like, damn it, I never thought about that. Look at what Callie spotted.
Well, so we were talking about substrate use and how when you train aerobically, it helps your body become better at using fats and sparing glycogen. And one of the mechanisms is that catecholamines and like sympathetic nervous system activation decreases. Mm-hmm. And the reason that helps is because epinephrine and norepinephrine stimulate phosphorylase for muscle glycogen to break down. But I was wondering how that affects lipolysis, since these also stimulates the breakdown of fat.
Yes. So this will potentially appear on a test. some ways. So you start exercising, you get epinephrine and norepinephrine release. Does that epinephrine and norepinephrine play some role in mobilizing free fatty acids out of adipose tissue? And if so, how? Kelvin, what do you think?
I believe so.
Do you remember there's a particular thing that helps break down adipose tissue? Remember what that is? There's an enzyme.
The hormone-sensitive lipase.
Yes, hormone-sensitive lipase. Okay? Stimulated by epinephrine and norepinephrine, which will then break those things down. So Callie's question, which I never really thought about, is if, as I become more trained, we know that I'm using more fat at any given exercise intensity, yet I'm also getting less epinephrine and norepinephrine. So what the hell is going on? And so, Callie, I read a bunch of different things today trying to find an answer for you. And here's what I think I've come up with, okay? So for the best that I can tell, most of the increase in fat used as an energy substrate is not driven by supply issues. If that makes any sense. It's not driven by, it's not like we're going to mobilize more fat, therefore we're going to have more to use, okay? And so what happens is that because you have more mitochondria, and because you have more capillaries, for any amount of fat that has already been mobilized out of adipose tissue, we're going to have it's going to be more likely that that will get taken up into our muscle cells, and more likely that those free fatty acids will interact with the mitochondria. And so the change is really driven on the muscle side by having more capillaries and more mitochondria, rather than simply making more free fatty acids available because of all that. And in some ways, you actually have less available because of the increase in stimulation of hormone-sensitive lipase. Okay. There are some other enzymes that also play a role in the midst of all of this. There's something called lipoprotein lipase that helps to break down lipoproteins. And you seem to get more lipoprotein lipase when you have more capillaries, and so that seems to be where most of it is driven. Although it was really kind of glossed over in like every textbook that I could find. So they're like, yes, this is what happens, but these two things happen, but let's not talk about how those things are maybe incongruent with each other. So there you go. Very good question.
Hey, Dr. Black.
Yes, Jacob.
With that topic, I was just curious if what you thought about this. I know that like with the autonomic nervous system and sympathetic activation, the central command is of relative intensity levels. So would it maybe make sense that since someone that's undertrained at the same absolute workload would be having more central command activation, it would have more sympathetic activation compared to the person that's trained, so they would be using more sugar because it's stimulating the breakdown of glycogen?
That seems like something that could be plausible, Jay.
Because like if you're trained and you have the mitochondria, I agree with everything you're saying, right? Like it's not an uptake thing. It's just why is it different between the two? Wouldn't the difference in like activation level of central command maybe compared to the two people might cause one to have a higher sugar intake just at the beginning than the other guy would, trainee?
I'm not sure. I think that's certainly a possibility. But I'm not going to lie, I was quite underwhelmed by most of the things that I could find in all of this. And everybody kept referencing back to the Galnick and Saltine paper that I showed you guys data from with the Michaelis-Menten plots. And it was just like their entire answer was just, oh, well, when you have more mitochondria, you improve the sensitivity of the system. And so what basically happens then is that for any amount of fat that is in your bloodstream, by having more mitochondria, you're going to draw more in, you're going to use more of it, than you would if you had less mitochondria. That seemed to be their answer for everything. And it just kept getting referenced back to the same thing, even though that paper doesn't really talk about that. And so, so I don't know. There may be some kind of untapped stuff there that I was not able to kind of come across today.
I mean, and everything that paper says does make sense though, because I mean, if it's not necessarily about, like, if you're taking in more fat just because you have more mitochondria, and the increase that you get of sympathetic activation on the fat wouldn't necessarily affect the like actual uptake of it. It's the mitochondria that do that, but the glycogen breakdown is affected by sympathetic activity. So it makes sense that the untrained person has more sympathetic activity, thus they probably use more sugar than the person that's untrained.
Yeah, so there may be some that there's a little less glycogen breakdown, and there, so you've got kind of less glycogen breakdown and the same fat kind of output, plus your mitochondria are better able to use that fat, and so kind of the net out of all of that is that we use more fat and a little bit less carbs. So, and that seems to be conserved regardless of what your diet is. If you have more mitochondria, no matter what you're eating, you're gonna, how much fat you eat, the carbs you eat, you're gonna use more fat. So. Okay, let's do some critical thinking. Ryan, read us the critical thinking question, please.
How can the Fick equation be used to explain increases in VO2 max following training? Be specific regarding adaptations or I don't know why that's hard for me. That might affect each component of Fick.
Okay. So would you like to take a component of fit and tell us?
Yeah, so basically I was just saying that an increase in VO2 max following training because the max cardiac output times VO2 difference is what makes up max VO2. So for max cardiac output, you need also your max stroke volume and max heart rate. And so as you train, your stroke volume increases, but it also does with your AVO2 because that includes basically your capillaries and your mitochondria.
Okay.
And so as your VO2 max increases, that's like how the equation can be used to explain the increases in VO2. And like muscles also have a great ability to like drive oxygen because of the mitochondria and the capillaries. And so those also increase VO2 max.
Okay. Very good. All you have to do is just give us one. I'm going to have somebody else do another one. That's great. All right, so let me give you guys a scenario here, okay? Let's try this out. Which component of the Fick equation do you think is going to be the most affected by an increase in plasma volume? I train for like 3 or 4 days. My plasma volume goes up, so my max VO2 goes up. We can measure it within a couple of days, a measurable increase. If we're very precise with our testing. So what part of Fick is going to change that quickly that might let my VO2 go up?
Oxygen content, for fill the blood, or probably makes me as blood, and just in general, if you have an increased plasma or increased blood volume overall, you probably have an increased amount of oxygen content, which is probably going to have a positive impact on oxygen content, period. To be able to.
I would agree that if I have a positive oxygen content, that can make VO2 go up. Megan, what do you think? Do you agree with Alex's thing that if I make my blood volume go up, I'm going to increase basically my O2 carrying capacity of my revenue that quickly?
Well, I would probably say stroke volume.
Okay, why would you say stroke volume?
Just like off the top of my head, remembering what the PowerPoint said, that if you have more positive volume, you're going to stretch your ventricle a little bit more, so you can push out more blood.
Okay.
That's one of the main adaptations with stroke volume.
Okay.
And so you push out more blood, you get more cardiac output, you get more VO2 max, and that can change like overnight.
Okay. Alex, do you remember the time course when plasma volume, when our blood volume changes? It changes really quickly. Do you remember that there's a little bit of a different time course for the plasma change versus when the red cells are going to change? Do you remember which comes first off the top of your head?
I don't remember the time frames. I know it's on the PowerPoints.
Okay.
I can't remember them.
Callie, can you help him out?
Yeah, first it's immediately is gonna change to plasma, and then like there's like a lag. I think that you said like a 2 to 3 week lag in red blood cells.
Correct. Okay. So, Alex, what you suggested is very much something that as my red cell content will go up after a couple of weeks, then that would very much be one of the things that would contribute to my increased VO2 max. But in like the first week or so, all of the blood volume change is going to mostly be just plasma. And so I'm probably going to get more stroke volume because I've got more plasma volume and get rid of the extra time. It's probably going to be on that side versus the carrying capacity. So then the carrying capacity will catch up and we'll get some more air. Okay? But that's the kind of question that I would ask you guys on the test. Like, use the Fick equation, right, to explain to us, okay, something like this. So, Pearson, let's assume that you and I are identical twins, except, okay, for the fact that I am 42 and you are, how old are you, Pearson? 22, 23?
22.
22. God. Okay. My old ass here. So you're my clone, okay? But you're 22 and I'm 42. Using the Fick equation, assuming everything else about us is equal, which one of us should have the higher VO2 max?
I would assume the 22-year-old.
You would assume correctly. Now comes the real question is, why?
I guess because cardiac output with, taking into account heart rate and stroke volume.
Yes.
At my age, heart rate can get higher than
Absolutely
at age
correct.
42.
Nice. Well done. Right? You have 20 more beats per minute in your max heart rate than I do. And so assuming everything else was identical, that fact alone means you have a bigger cardiac output than I do. And so you should then have a higher VO2 max. Okay? We don't do much of that in this class. People that care, I think next fall, Cal 1 will teach the aging class. But one of the things that happens with age is there's an age associated. Jacob, why are you chuckling? Okay, we can't hear you. He's just talking to himself now. So, you're good? You don't want to be on tape saying things? Okay. One of the things that happens with age is there's an age-associated decline in VO2 max. And part of that is just unavoidable and is driven by the age-associated decline in cardiac output because max heart rate is going to fall. The SA node and things are going to become less sensitive to norepinephrine, and so you're just going to get less of a response. You're going to get a little bit of a less of a symptomatic response as well. Okay? Good. So that's what I'm wanting you guys to understand. We can use Fick, right, to try to figure out what is changing and how is that change going to therefore account for some of our things that are going to go on with VO2 max. Okay? So we'll try another one. Kelvin. Earlier you were drinking something and I figured out that your bottle was red. I thought you were drinking like tomato juice or something. And I was like, oh, Kelvin, what is happening? So Kelvin, let's talk about if I shift fiber types from type 2X to type 2A. How is that shift in fiber type? How can we plausibly explain which component of Fick is going to be affected by that shift in fiber type that might make my VO2 max go up?
I would have to say the efficiency at which that fiber is using ATP. So the increase in like mitochondrial density and so basically AVO2 difference,
Okay.
I would say is the most effective.
Perfect. That's right. Okay. 2X to 2As, the 2As tend to have more capillaries and more mitochondria, right? And that's going to lead to the potential for greater extraction, therefore it's going to affect ADH. Okay. Okay. Good. Was there another question? Was that the only one? There's two more. Okay. Jacob, read us the second question, please.
Oh God. Okay. A well-known physiologist has argued that all fatigue we experience each day is due to central mechanisms.
Yes.
His argument is that we can create peripheral fatigue in the lab and in lab animals, but it never occurs in real life. Defend and attempt to refute his argument.
All right. Do you agree or do you disagree? Let's start there.
Well, I think that I honestly think it's a mix of both. It makes sense to me that when we talk about like central fatigue, a lot of arguments that I know get brought around this is the fact that you have efferent feedback such as pain and like your metabolite receptors that are gonna be like telling your brain, hey, this is getting dangerous. Maybe we shouldn't continue to do this. So your brain's gonna like slow down. Same thing with your like glycogen levels and stuff like that. It'll tell your brain to like maybe not go as intense. But I also think that when it comes to peripheral fatigue, while we can't, our body was made to never have peripheral fatigue be the main reason why we stop exercising. I think it occurs simultaneously. I think that those metabolites that get developed during exercise do partially play roles in like blocking the uridine receptors from doing their job or the T2 and things like that. But the whole central fatigue mechanism is we always want central fatigue to tell us to stop before peripheral fatigue does, because if peripheral fatigue actually eventually makes us stop, like what people are suggesting, we'd have tetanus and then we'd be really screwed.
Okay. So way to walk that right down the middle there. Like a true scientist, I appreciate that. So, Ryan, I'm going to ask you this question. Okay. Did you work out? You worked out yesterday? Or today?
I did this morning and yesterday.
Did this morning? What did you do this morning?
With the cycle board?
With the cycle board. Did you lift weights yesterday?
No, I did not. I actually
Just a cardio. Okay, but you have done resistance training at some point in the reasonably near past?
Yeah,
Tuesday. Okay. Do you think while you were lifting weights on Tuesday that you experienced peripheral fatigue? No?
Well, I mean, the CrossFit games.
Did you lift to failure on Tuesday? Okay. Have you ever lifted to failure?
Yes.
Okay. Have you ever gotten to that point you're like, I'm going to do one more rep, damn it, and not been able to, like, I cannot do it. I'm trying as hard as I can, right? People are yelling at me and all kinds of things, and I can't do it. Okay? That sounds like peripheral fatigue, right? So, Jacob, how would you explain that? Is that peripheral fatigue?
I mean,
Why might, if she was doing, say, a set of 5, she could do 5 reps but not 6, even though she's super motivated? What might be the most likely thing that is not allowing her to do another rep?
I mean, listen, we have pain receptors and you're going to start feeling it by the time you get to that last one. And, even though you're super motivated, that doesn't, like, your motivation is conscious while your brain has unconscious mechanisms that probably tell it, let's not.
Should I tell Jacob that we have some fairly compelling evidence that pain does not actually inhibit one-off maximal strength and those kinds of things? It seems to be a much more of an issue when you do like cycling or running or things, but like if it's just like 1 rep max, even if that shit hurts, like we can get people to fully kind of recruit in those things. So would that surprise you?
No, I'm not saying that there's people that that aren't able to get over that.
One of those people that just for Ryan, that's what would happen. I'm sorry, I'm just trolling now. I'm just being a pain in the butt. Okay.
No, yeah, there's some people that would be able to do it, but if we're talking about as a population as a whole, probably not most people.
Okay. Callie, what do you think?
like this whole question, or just what you were
Let's
asking?
start with what I am asking, and then we'll work our way backwards to the whole question.
Okay. Well, you were saying, okay, what if she can't do one more rep? Well, wouldn't that be like, could that be considered weakness? Like she doesn't have that, she can't initially produce that force. Like it's not fatigue that's the problem. She just physically is not built to lift.
Okay, sure. So let me clarify my definition of weakness. We would make the argument that since she had already lifted the weight multiple times, that she was at some point physically able to have that much strength. That weakness really is like, I can't do this once at all times ever. That's probably a better clarification of. I like it. Callie really makes me be precise with my definition. So what do you think if I'm trying to do 5 reps and I do 5, but I can't do 6? What's the most plausible thing that might be going on so that I cannot do a 6th rep?
I mean, I'm thinking it's peripheral fatigue because I just like thinking personally and like trying to do an extra rep, but you just physically can't do it. Like it's not the pain. It's just like you can't make your arms like work. There's just something wrong.
Okay. Kelvin, what might be that something wrong? What's going on? It's not letting you do that. What might you have used up?
So it could be several different things. It could be from the calcium released by the action potential, intracellular calcium release.
Okay.
Also, maybe even excitation contraction coupling. I think we're still working on pinpointing where it could be, even with like the ryanodine receptors and T tubules.
Okay.
So I'm not sure exactly where.
Anybody here? What else might be gone? ATP. Okay. While I'm doing that, I don't know how long it takes Ryan to do like five reps if she was doing a squat, but it might take 20 seconds or something. What's gone? Why is the ATP gone? What else is gone? Creatine phosphate, gone, right? Why do you rest 5 minutes in between sets? Well, the half-life of the return of creatine phosphate is about 90 seconds. So you get half at 90. At 3 minutes, you're at sort of 75%, and then on and on, and so therefore that's why it is what it is. Okay? So in that way, I would argue that we can get some peripheral fatigue. Okay? Now, this fellow, his name is Tim Noakes, likes to make these arguments. Tim is an ass. And he's South African, and he is now like the guy that says basically, it used to be that like all fatigue is central and those kinds of things. Now his new thing is that basically low carb, high fat will basically solve all of our health problems. Like it will cure cancer because tumors only feed on carbohydrates, so we're going to starve the tumors and those kinds of things. And that basically like we shouldn't give our kids, like we shouldn't breastfeed your kids because like babies need to be on low carb, high fat, and all this other stuff. He's actually a medical doctor, and the people in South Africa, they pulled his medical license and sanctioned him for some of this stuff. So, but he has quite a following on social media and those things. So his argument though is a fascinating one, right? Just think about most of the time when you do things outside of maybe I'm doing reps to failure, right? So maybe when's the last time you do exercise? Did you do some kind of cardio the last few days? Kind of?
I did like sprints. I mean, that's not cardio.
Okay, we'll call that sort of an intervally-ish thing, right? But think about when you were doing that. Could you have gone one more step?
Yeah.
Okay. Could have gone a little bit harder for one more step, for 2 more steps. Think about all the times that you do cardio or things like that, where you're not doing like lifting weights right to failure when you have a spotter or something, right? Why did you stop? Why didn't you do that one more step? Why didn't you do one more step faster? Like what?
Because I reached the distance of how far.
You reached how far you wanted to go?
Yeah.
Okay. So what you're telling me is you chose to stop. Yes, right? Most of us do that, right? We choose to stop. That's his argument, is that is central fatigue, right? You could have done more, but your brain told you not to. Like you did not go all the way to depletion of acetylcholine, to total sort of failure of calcium release, to kind of total. He would argue that nobody goes all the way to total lack of ATP production in the muscle to where you're going to get a fused tetanus, where you're basically stuck like in a cramp in your muscle, which in theory we can stimulate animal muscle or isolated human muscles to get to that particular point. Right? I can remember being in a study like 2 weeks into my master's program where they were doing E-stim on my quad, and they were doing this fatigue test, and I've never wanted something like from an exercise standpoint, I've never felt like less whole body sort of fatigue, but yet more uncomfortable and more fatigued like in one muscle in my entire life, and just wanting it to stop so desperately badly on things, because you were getting like 100 milliseconds of rest in between contractions. And so it was just like, you're just like, no, like just let it rest for like 2 seconds. Like just give me 2 seconds of a break. It was really bad. So peripheral fatigue in that way. And so in that way, Jacob's part is right. That there is peripheral fatigue, and that peripheral fatigue very often you're going to then feel uncomfortable because it is occurring. And then you're going to try to then use your brain to adjust how fast you're going or how much force you're generating in an effort to kind of gauge, I can only feel this uncomfortable for so long before I have to stop, so I better die. Okay. So we will get into a little bit of this in the very last one, the stuff that determines performance, but there's fascinating data. There's some fascinating data from a lab in University of Utah, Salt Lake City, and they inject people with a nerve block in their spinal cord. So they inject people with fentanyl. It's the good stuff. Right? So you get a fentanyl injection, and it blocks all afferent feedback from the muscles to the brain, but it has no effect on efferent going down. So you can still exercise and contract, but you just basically don't feel anything while you're doing it. And they block all of that stuff, and people tear ass out on the bike and feel great, and they overshoot, and then they get all this peripheral fatigue, and they just crap out really, really early, and it really, really hinders their exercise performance. Right? So it's the same person, same VO2 max, same critical power, all of those things. That lack of afferent feedback, that lack of being able to sense peripheral fatigue happening, totally messes up their ability to kind of gauge how hard they're going to need to go for a long period of time. It's really crazy. So we've done some stuff in my lab. I don't think Kelvin did this. It may have been before Kelvin got here. We did the opposite. Rather than block the afferent feedback, we actually enhance it. So we would take one leg and have people do contractions with one leg until it couldn't go anymore. And then we inflated a blood pressure cuff around that leg, so we trapped all of those metabolites that signal peripheral fatigue in that leg. And then had you do exercise with the contralateral leg to see if we could make things worse. So now we've amped up all of this sense of peripheral fatigue, even though there's not really peripheral fatigue in the muscles that you're using. So that can we then change the way the brain is interpreting everything, and we will not let you do as much with that. So it's kind of a trick question. There's probably both going on all the time, and there is this interplay between the two. So Jacob, you gave a very good answer. I'm just being an asshole about the whole thing. Is what we should take away from all of this. So.
Oh, I'm aware.
Oh, she's like, oh yes, I'm aware. So there we go. Okay. Pearson, what's question 3?
Question 3 says, Most collegiate cross-country runners compete at distances that range from 6,000 to 10,000 meters. Elite men covered 10,000 meters in approximately 30 minutes, while elite women cover 6,000 meters in approximately 20 minutes. Many of these runners train by running 70 to 90 miles per week. Do you think this is the most effective and efficient training method? Why or why not? And I said that for the most part, I would probably agree. But just because if they only train at the length that they compete at, they're not like, I'm trying to think what the word we used in class, but they're not like shocking or overloading their bodies. And so after not very long, they won't like see results. But the only thing that made me think maybe to not totally agree is if they're just running the 70 to 90 miles a week at a low intensity,
Okay.
then they might not get much.
Okay. I like that answer. Alex, what do you think?
I would 100% agree with the part of this we talked about risk overload. I don't really know anything about programming when it comes to long distance running, but I just think general principles that are just like generally applicable to training. So ideally, I think it's too general to say let's just run 70 to 90 miles total volume a week. Let's just define like what is enough volume for an athlete to drive adaptations, but what would be too much volume for that person to not be able to recover from that, to accumulate too much fatigue, where would we fall into that, and then progressively work from there. We're trying to stay in the ranges between what is most effective for self-driving adaptations, but not driving too fatigue.
Okay. I had not really thought about the question in that particular way, from an overtraining standpoint. That's a very important consideration. So, Megan, used to be the track person. Is my characterization that they run a ton pretty, does that jive with your experience with the distance runners?
Yes and no. So they'll have days where they're like, oh, I have much time for 10-mile run or whatever. But I also saw them doing a lot of intervals.
Okay.
And that's kind of what, am I allowed to answer?
You are allowed to answer, yes.
That's kind of what caused me to say what I said, that just running 90 miles per week might not be as effective as incorporating some other methods. So we talked about how to increase your lactate threshold, you have to train above your lactate threshold, and you're not going to be doing that for miles upon miles. That's done through use of intervals.
Okay.
Secondly, we talked about just using a duration over 40 minutes doesn't change. Like 60 minutes compared to 40 minutes isn't going to have any more change with your VO2 max. And so while training at long durations and long mileage will be good getting you ready for the race, and knowing what it's going to be like for a longer duration, it might not necessarily be as effective at increasing your VO2 as you might think. And then third, you see a lot of long distance runners that have shin splints and stress fractures, and it's a lot due to just the straight mileage they have. So having 70 to 90 miles per week might be contributing a little bit more to those injuries than if they put it down to intervals or cross training. So I don't think it's as efficient or effective.
So if I only ever have to run 10 kilometers, which is literally like 6.5 miles or something, why would I ever be like, oh, I'm just going to go for a 10-mile run? Why would I do that? Right? Like, what's the point? I'm going to go 10 miles. It's well over like my race time. That probably means that I'm going to run slower than what my race time is going to be, if not significantly slower. And so, if it takes me an hour, I'm not going to get any further increase in VO2 max by doing 10 miles rather than doing like 6 or something. I'm probably not at a high enough intensity. I'm already in really, really good shape. So that intensity is probably not going to be enough to drive any kind of actual adaptations. What the hell am I doing? I'm just out there putting stress on my shins, my joints, and other things. I had a cross-country guy on the cross-country team that was in my lab several years ago. And we used to get into not knockdown drag-outs about this, but we would argue about this a lot. Because I'm like, Dan, you know better. Like, what the physiology is. Yeah, but they would run like 3 times a day. I'm like, what are you doing? Why are you doing this? It's a psychological thing.
I think it's a little bit of this is how we've always done it. So
Yes.
we keep doing it.
The coaches think, oh, well, you know, if you're an SEC school, well, Arkansas distance runners do this. But, you know, Arkansas's won like 35 straight SEC, you know, indoor and outdoor track championships and cross country championships. Well, their runners run this much, so that must be the way that we do it, right? That must be the right way. And there's, you know, I don't know. There's just, this is how we've done it. Or this guy that's an Olympian runs this much, right? These guys just run all the time. So we think we should just run all the time.
Dr. Black.
Yes, Jake.
So, like, in my answer as well, I just like straight up was like, I don't know training adaptations specifically, as we've discussed before.
What about training adaptations?
But
Well,
you're asking for which one's efficient. I don't have any athletic training knowledge, but I did run cross country in high school. And one thing that I brought into the equation was like, yeah, we know that we're not going to be necessarily further increasing our like physiological ability, but wouldn't the mental aspect of, yes, you're not necessarily running as like hard, but you're mentally preparing yourself for farther distances, for different terrains. So you're just mentally preparing yourself for the fatigue that could happen during a race. Wouldn't that be affecting your motivation and your drive?
Run the distance you need to run in the race. Why run farther?
Because then you have the ability to say, I ran farther than this before. It's all a mental thing. Like, it's all something that you or tell yourself you did something already that's already been longer distance than before. You can finish this race that's shorter.
How far were your races in high school?
The races were 3.1, I think, miles.
Okay. They ran a 5K, right?
Right.
High school. I bet every one of us, including my old out of shape ass, could run a 5K. You know, if I had to. It would be slow, but I can make it, right? So that's my question is just, these people are in such good shape that the distance isn't the problem, right? You can cover that much distance. The problem is, it's that distance at that particular pace, right? And so, I don't know. I think, you know, if you want to tell me that we're going to try to run at race pace for an even longer period of time, that's fine. Like, doing a marathon is a different thing because, like, it's hours, okay? And you're going to feel terrible when you deplete your muscle glycogen at like mile 18. But when you're running a 10K, that's not a problem. Blood glucose isn't a problem. And so there's a lot of kind of ins and outs. And I appreciate what you're saying. It is useful to have people have some confidence psychologically that I can cover this distance, I've gone farther, I can do this, right? But from a purely physiological adaptation standpoint, like what we talked about, what is it that's going to make my VO2 max go up? What is it that's going to make my lactate threshold go up? What is it that's going to make my critical power, my critical velocity go up? Because that's what I need during the race to be able to do something. Now, at that distance, if you ever watch track on TV or anything, my guy that was the cross-country runner was always watching like races and, like, on YouTube and things because it's about strategy. It's not just who's the fastest. It's we're all going to run and we're going to go slow, 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 and then sprint and kick at the end and do some other things. And there's a lot of strategery and kind of gamesmanship that goes into it. And so, I don't know. So, it makes for good questions on a test, but in actual practice, I don't know much about that. But to ask Callie, she's the one that's the distance runner out of all of us. So back in the day when I used to go try to run over on the track, she would just lap me over and over and over again. So maybe Kelvin's the distance runner. Right? See, I was going to ask Kelvin about one of our fatigue questions is, hey, Kelvin, do you guys ever see and measure peripheral fatigue in the basketball players after a practice or after a game?
Yeah, but so I was going to actually go back to number 2, if that's okay, because I feel like it's kind of hinting, the way it was kind of coming at me is like everyday experiences of fatigue, and it almost feels like it's saying like after a day, all that fatigue that was just yesterday is gone, and that's not necessarily the case. It's just like the differences in like we've talked about high and low frequency fatigue, and how low frequency fatigue is so much longer to recover from, and that's something that I think that's like super important for measuring peripheral fatigue.
That's right. I don't know that we talked about. Have we talked about in class? We talked about the difference between high and low frequency fatigue. Judging how everybody that is here is looking at me with those frowny faces, the answer is no. So what Kelvin is talking about is a really fascinating kind of thing. So you do something today, and you cause some amount of peripheral fatigue today. Okay. A portion of all of that should completely recover itself within minutes to an hour or so, right? Creatine phosphate should reconstitute itself. You should be able to clear out and get pH back down to kind of a more normal level. Maybe that may take a little bit longer, but you can get those things kind of cleaned out. But we sometimes see peripheral fatigue that lingers, that stays around for 24, 48, 72 hours later. And much of that peripheral fatigue seems to manifest during contractions that occur at a lower firing frequency. Okay? And so what that looks like then is that we have shifted the force frequency curve. For any number of action potentials, we're getting less calcium release out of the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And so what we're seeing is that there's an impairment in excitation contraction coupling that may stay for a little while. And what that looks like tomorrow may be that you can generate close to the same amount of force, but it feels more difficult for you to get to that force because you have to drive the muscles at a higher, kind of a submaximal level. You got to drive it at a higher firing frequency to get there, or you may have a little bit of a decrement kind of on the top end of things. And so experimentally, we test this when we use electrical stimulation. We look at a ratio of kind of a very high frequency number of action potential stem versus a much lower one. You can see some of this low frequency fatigue that may stay around for a couple of days afterwards. That may be something that is even imperceptible. Like people feel fine, but they can't perform as well because that's what you can't get as much calcium. So, help to remind me, did Aaron measure low frequency fatigue as part of his dissertation?
I believe so, yeah.
I think so. So there's some fascinating things. And low frequency fatigue seems to occur very, very often when you do kind of like basketball practice. You think there's lots of stops and starts and that kind of stuff in there. There seems to be more. Okay. Y'all got other things we need to talk about?
Is creatine phosphate depletion, is that peripheral fatigue or central fatigue?
I would call it peripheral fatigue, Kelly.
Okay.
Glycogen depletion or falling blood glucose levels or plasma glucose levels, you could almost argue is both, because like you physically don't have substrate to be able to turn into energy. But also, as those things fall, then the brain is going to make it more difficult for you to fire your motor units anyway. So you're going to kind of get a double whammy from those two things. But creatine phosphate is purely, to me, it's purely peripheral. Okay.
Test is Tuesday, right?
Test on Tuesday. I'm going to record the pulmonary lecture in the morning. I promise you. It's on my schedule. It's happening. Right? It's happening. If you've looked at the slides, it's super straightforward. There's only going to be a couple of questions on there about that anyway. Mostly because I hate that's gonna get up, that'll be there. Test will be the same format, okay? You know, you guys did pretty well the last time, just kind of keep at it. Okay, so it's gonna go from metabolism 2 through aerobic training. Okay. And then a week from now, we start the really broing out kind of stuff as we talk about resistance training adaptations. Okay. All right, that's what I got. For my folks that aren't here, can you please email me your critical thinking questions? I'll get you guys ready.